when someone has experienced something traumatic that had them feel powerless at that time, how the therapy can help them reconnect to the power they have, inside of them. So when I say empowerment, I don't mean I'm the one giving them power, because that's also a disempowering position, but more how do we help the person reconnect to the power within them, especially in the face of a situation that had them feel powerless and that where someone more powerful hurt them.
Welcome to Third Culture Therapy, a podcast that looks at the unique ways our social identity and cultural heritage impact our mental and emotional well-being. I'm Leila Maghrabi, writer, journalist, and host of this show. Hello, listeners. Today's conversation is with Reema, a US-trained counselling psychologist from the United Arab Emirates, who shares her feelings of disintegration after returning to her birthplace of Dubai after 10 years away and finding it a dramatically changed city. Reema also talks about the ongoing developments within the mental health space in the UAE, what the common issues her clients come to her with, and how a holistic narrative approach to therapy can help people better understand and reclaim their life story. Before we get going, let me give her a proper introduction. Reema Baniabbasi is an Emirati counselling psychologist at the Psychiatry and Therapy Centre in Dubai Healthcare City. Reema was born and raised in Dubai and lived in Boston, USA for 10 years before returning to her hometown in 2018. As well as her regular therapy practice, Reema is a prolific writer. She is a columnist at Sale magazine, where she shares her thoughts on mental health. Her writing is very thoughtful and lends itself to poetry, which she also writes. Her English poems have been published in a few literary journals based in the US, UK, and Hong Kong. Reema is also a consultant with Takalam, an Arabic mental health app. Reema, welcome to the show. It's a real pleasure to have you. How are you doing today?
Thank you. I'm doing well and actually very excited to be part of this conversation.
Yeah, me too. I'm very excited to be picking your brains today. I want to get started from where it is that you are, actually, which is Dubai in the UAE. Where you grew up and where you have now lived for a few years after your return. Dubai is the city that I know fairly well because I lived there for 5 years myself. So there are some things I'm sure I'm going to relate to, but definitely many, many things that I don't know that I'm intrigued to learn from you. You did leave for a stretch for 10 years from college onwards, and then you came back and you found, like so many people do, you found Dubai had dramatically changed. Something that you've written about in the articles that you publish. And I read one in which you described the experience as being quite difficult, and you called it raw and disintegrating. Can you explain what you meant by that and why that was the case?
Yeah. So when I first came back, I noticed that literally I wouldn't know what kind of Reema I would be in a given day. So in that sense, it was disintegrating in that way. So I noticed that I did feel quite depressed, actually, maybe for the first year and a half of being back. And it did impact, my confidence. I had imposter syndrome, which is where you basically question your skill sets and what you have to offer and compare yourself to others and kind of feel, oh, I was only chosen and hired for a random reason versus for my actual skills, and then I'll be found out soon, hence the word imposter. So I was feeling that way for quite some time. And it was raw in the sense that it just felt like too much. And there would be days where I would literally feel like everything was like a dream to me, like nothing felt real. And I felt, where is home? This is not home. I don't feel rooted anymore. And that added to a sense of disintegration. But over time, this did shift for me, but definitely that first year and a half of being back was definitely quite challenging. But it also gave me a lot of insights when working with people dealing with difficult transitions, especially in a very culturally diverse city like Dubai, where many people have moved, whether countries or schools or homes.
Yeah, it's interesting how you describe this imposter syndrome. So you felt it as in when you were in the UAE back on your home turf. Um, for those, I mean, you can check out, of course, Reema's extensive CV online, but you did do your bachelor's in psychology and master's in counseling psychology, both from Northeastern University in Boston, and you have gained various certificates thereafter and experience. What was it about being home specifically that made you feel like an imposter?
Yeah, good question. And it's kind of funny that you phrase it that way. It's like, you have extensive CV, you have all these certifications. What reason do you have to doubt yourself? Kind of thing, especially in my own turf, right?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I guess. Like for me, like yes, I was born and raised here, but then when I moved to the States, I literally just turned 18 when I moved there. Like my birthday was in the same month as when I moved. So I was 17, then I became 18 just a few weeks after,
Right. Really
right? And
young.
10 years I was there. So I basically became an adult in the US. And sure, I visited my country once a year, maybe a couple of times I came once every 2 years, but I was still maintaining that contact. But then visiting is very different than living, especially as an adult. And my family had also moved homes during the time that I was studying. So when I came back, I came to the home that I saw as a vacation home almost, because that was the home I'd come to when I visit, versus the home I grew up with and left to the States, right? So I had to transition to that, to seeing this new home as no, this is no longer a vacation home. It's home right now. It's a different neighborhood. Um, there are things that have changed, and on top of it, I'm learning to navigate the city as an adult, not as a child, where I was more dependent on family to take me around and go places. Right, so there was that part of it. Then the other part was, I guess, I worked with a very different client demographic back in the States, right? So in the US, I worked with people of mixed, low socioeconomic status to maybe you could say low middle. That would be the range. I worked with refugees, with immigrants, asylum seekers, domestic violence survivors, and people uh, who were veterans, as well as other Americans, right, who have their own problems. And then when I moved here, right, initially I worked in a clinic where majority of the clients were, you could say, upper class, or maybe they may have grown up less privileged or even poor, but then suddenly shifted up, right? So that was a very different mindset I had to work with. And many of them had very, very high expectations of what therapy was supposed to be, that I felt I could not meet. And since I was already feeling so raw and disintegrated, it did chip away at my confidence. And I'm sure our clients must have picked up on that,
Right.
and didn't feel like I was that anchoring presence right in the beginning. And then I moved to a different clinic where now my clients, so you could say, a mix between maybe you could say low middle to upper class. So it's a bit more mixed. And I noticed that people's expectations, while some do have very high expectations, I think I have also developed more confidence over time to know how to address them, and continuing my mentorship relationship with one of my past clinical supervisors in the States has been immensely helpful in me developing my professional identity here in Dubai, but also in me transitioning better
Right.
coming back.
No, I understand. I want to address this point you raised about expectations and the thoughts, maybe some of the misconceptions or preconceived ideas, rather, that people come to to therapy with. But first, can you describe what sort of therapy or counseling it is that you provide?
Yes. So I personally provide, I guess, like many therapists, we tend to have an eclectic approach. Very rarely do you meet a therapist who is a purist in one approach. And I would say even those who claim to be a purist, they still bring in aspects of their personality and their unique presence into their work. So nobody is actually 100% purist in the type of therapy they do. But me personally, I combine between narrative therapy, which is a type of therapy that is meant to be collaborative. So it's not about me being, oh, I'm the doctor, I know everything, and you're the patient, you know nothing. It's more about co-creating, a way people can retell their stories in ways that are empowering for themselves. It's not about sugarcoating, oh, here's a silver lining in your story. It's more about acknowledging the both and of your story and having a thicker narrative that's not just defined by only the problem or only limited societal ideas, but the totality of you, everything you're in a relationship with, whether it's people who are precious to you, whether it's values that matter to you, whether it's hopes and dreams you have for yourself, whether it's the strengths you have, the things that helped you get through different problems in your life. So it's a more empowering, collaborative approach to therapy that's less about saying, you are the problem, there's something wrong with you. It's more about, okay, what are the problems that are coming in the way of what you want in life and your values and things that are precious to you in life, and what can we do about that? So that's my main, the narrative therapy anchors my core ethics. But on the side, I also combine other approaches depending on my client's needs and people's different cultural backgrounds and personalities. So I do combine aspects of trauma responsive, mindfulness based therapies, a bit of the somatic approach, and both of which have a more mind body connection. So, how our emotions get expressed in our body, and how, sometimes therapy can be too stuck in the head.
Yes.
Too much about over intellectualizing, but we experience everything in our bodies end of the day. And when we can engage that in the moment, like, okay, how is this showing up for you in your body right now? And having that curiosity versus judgment toward ourselves can help us see, what else might this be trying to tell us? What else might we discover that maybe we're not as able to see because we're so lost in the day-to-day grind?
Yeah. No, absolutely. And it's very true what you say about we can get very lost and stuck in our heads and in the stories that we tell and we repeat, but also just the intellectualizing of it. And my experience when I've been to therapy has always been a case of my therapist trying to bring me back to my feelings and my body. So whenever anything comes up, he's like, where do you feel, where is it coming up? And it was tricky at the beginning, even though if I consider myself fairly open and aware, but I was definitely stuck many times on that question. Like, I can tell you what I think about this situation, but now I have to really stop and wait and listen and hear. And you do come up with different answers or definitely different insights when you approach it that way, but it isn't something that we're practiced to do in our day-to-day lives. What sort of expectations did your clients come to you with? You mentioned expectations earlier, and I'm intrigued to understand more about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is technically common globally, right? But maybe I imagine that when you work with people who are directly paying for the therapy versus in a nonprofit, where that was most of where I worked in the States, right, in nonprofits. So people come in, they're not the ones paying. It's the federal government that's paying. It's the Medicare or mass health insurance that would be paying. Whereas here, most people, they're paying out of pocket, or they may have insurance, but they might pay a certain amount, or some they don't, depending how good your insurance is, I guess, if you're lucky. But they still come in with the expectation, right, that The therapy is supposed to be a very quick fix, that maybe within 1 to maybe a couple, 3, 4 sessions, they'll be immediately better and all their childhood trauma from decades ago will be gone, right? Kind of thing. When that's not possible when you're talking to a stranger for just 1 hour, 2, 3, 4 hours, once a week. But also, even those who don't believe it's a quick fix, they may still come with the expectation that at some point in the therapy, they will have a major epiphany, when most of the time, that's not what therapy is about. It's more about these slow, tiny blocks we're building in each session, then eventually pile up. And as someone who's been to a therapist herself during my time in the States, and I do recommend every single therapist sees their own therapist. Otherwise, you might be potentially doing more harm to the people you're working with for not having that experience yourself.
You said you recommend every therapist does, and I was going to jump in and say, isn't that actually a requirement? Am I right?
Actually, it depends. It depends on the training.
Yeah.
So in some schools, they do require you, when you're a student even, that you see therapy. Others, they don't require it, but they recommend it. But I can at least speak for the States. I don't know how it is in other countries. But in the US, even if a school does not require therapy, you're still required to do what's called clinical supervision. So what that means is you basically meet with a therapist who's more advanced than you, and they're licensed, and you meet with them at least once a week to discuss the people you're seeing and what's the impact on you, a bit about your personal life and how it's impacting your work. And that's required in licensing to make sure, that you don't cause harm. Now, obviously, with the supervisor, you should not be sharing identifying information because you need to protect your client's privacy, but only enough that they would need to know, okay, what's your impact on your clients, how it's impacting you, just to make sure that you're not potentially doing any harm, right, as a result. And I would personally recommend that even advanced therapists continue seeing their clinical supervisor. I personally see mine who is based in the US, so they're not based here, because I find doing so here can be a bit tricky when it comes to confidentiality, because we're a small country and almost everybody knows each other. So I find it to be much safer to consult with someone based abroad than someone based here.
And do you find any disconnect or issues of translating what your context and your issues, for lack of a better word, are to someone who is so far away and so far removed from your daily life, or does it not matter?
Yeah, in this case, I'm lucky because both mentors I have had, or you can say clinical supervisors, but I call them mentors for simplicity's sake. So both the mentors I have are also narrative therapists. And what I like about them is, something my past mentor, before he passed away, something he told me is that every interaction, every person you see is a cultural experience, is a cultural encounter. Right? So what he meant by that is no matter who you're seeing, even if they share the exact same culture as you're still dealing with that person's individual culture and context, and you still need to approach that person with openness and curiosity about what is meaningful for them in their life versus imposing your own meaning on them.
Right. Yeah. So in that sense, it doesn't actually matter.
Yeah.
Because if you're operating with this system underlaying your interaction, then whatever it is that you're coming with, the practitioner on the other side is equipped to receive it and work with you on it, regardless of whether they directly have experience or firsthand understanding of it.
Right. I do want to pinpoint, though, that it is understandable, when it comes to a therapist-client relationship, that it is very understandable if clients are seeking out a therapist who does share the cultural background, because sometimes, no matter how curious you can be, sometimes people want to feel that, you just get it, and you don't have to explain yourself, those tiny nuances to you. You don't have to educate you or school you on their culture. And one thing I tell clients who come from a different culture than me is that I would be asking about their personal experience with their culture or their personal relationship with their culture. But when it comes to the culture itself, that's my job to do my homework and research, and not their job to
Right.
be the ones, schooling me, because that's extra emotional labor for them that they did not sign up for in coming to see me for therapy.
Yes,
Right?
100%. And I'm so glad that you said that and that you clarified that position, because I've wondered in a way on who, whose responsibility is that. And I think you make a really good point about the emotional labor, and that if I am going to someone, I don't want to be also bringing in a history lesson and an anthropological lesson into the session so that I can add the context. So it's good to know that, yes, the onus there should be on the practitioner, the therapist, to do their homework on that front. Just to go back a little bit in time to your sort of Dubai, US, and then Dubai experience, and you did mention obviously the issues that you felt with feeling a little bit perhaps out of your depth when you'd come back and join the employment fold in Dubai, but also you were talking about life as you had grown up to know it, really changing and shifting under you, and that experience in and of itself was very unsettling. And perhaps you can sort of describe a little bit what your childhood in Dubai was like, and then versus your then adulthood, your professional adulthood in Dubai, and how those experiences and your own relationship with the city, how it changed and impacted you as well.
Yeah, yeah. I would say that overall I had a good childhood, and which I recognize I'm very privileged in. And I think I come to appreciate even more in my line of work. Um, and at the same time, I guess every person has had their own set of challenges that can be different. And we can't compare them, right, to each other. Like in my case, I have experienced, bullying during my childhood years in the school. So, so while home was a safe space, school was a space where I would feel very anxious, stepping into, right, as a result. And I think back in the 90s, right, people didn't really take bullying seriously. And I can even see that in some of my client stories, those who grew up here within the 90s or 80s, right? And I learned from them, that definitely even physical kinds of bullying were not taken as seriously as they are right now in comparison. Definitely the country has made a lot of progress, right, in this area. But definitely there is, as with any country in the world, there's always room, to improve. But I do appreciate that we've been having more conversations about these issues than back in the day, in the past. Whereas before it was like, oh, don't be too sensitive. Just put it in one ear, take it out the other. For
Yeah.
the boys, just man up, be strong, fight back. Those kinds of things, right? So that has had an impact. But at the same time, I would say that when I entered high school, actually, no, maybe not high school, maybe I was about 13, actually, I would say, I started to get closer to my spirituality. And I think, reading the Quran more on my own versus only relying on what I was being taught in my Islamic classes, it taught me to see how the sacred expresses itself everywhere and within ourselves, to see beauty everywhere within ourselves. And from there, that helped me step out of my victim mindset and kind of try to be curious. Oh, I wonder, why do people act the way they do?
Right.
So when I had that mindset, it completely shifted how I feel about myself, how I felt about other people, and even in turn how other people interacted with me.
Interesting. Do you think that's the moment when you decided you wanted to become a therapist?
So it was a kind of a mix of moments, and this was part of it. The other part was, my father, he's an engineer, but he also is a very prolific reader. And so I grew up with a lot of books in the house. And among the many topics he loves to read on happens to be psychology. So I would sit and read them on my own.
Yeah.
And he would even talk to us as though we're adults, right? So I feel like that partly helped to foster my curiosity about the subject. Um, and so that combined with, the experience I just told you about, and then, witnessing one of my cousins being born and watching him grow up, because I was usually one of the younger people in the family, but then I
Right.
see, oh, here's someone even younger than me, and I see him as a baby, and I can watch him grow, and I would sometimes babysit him. That also made me curious about psychology, as well. And initially, I was more into the research, and I wasn't considering mental health until when I was in the States, by maybe you could say my second year university in the States. I started to volunteer for a rape crisis hotline for 2 years. And that made me fall in love with counseling and with therapy. And what made me fall in love with that in particular, even though I was doing crisis work, it's not the same as doing therapy work. Uh, but what I loved about it was this idea of empowerment, this idea of, when someone has experienced something traumatic that had them feel powerless at that time, how the therapy can help them reconnect to the power they have, inside of them. So when I say empowerment, I don't mean I'm the one giving them power, because that's also a disempowering position, but more how do we help the person reconnect to the power within them, especially in the face of a situation that had them feel powerless, and that where someone more powerful hurt them,
Right.
in that way. So that's what inspired me. That combined with when I started to learn more about what's often called mental health disorders, I learned that many of them, they're they're technically responses to abnormal situations, versus being in themselves abnormalities. They can be normal responses to abnormal circumstances and situations.
And in terms of your relationship with Dubai, the city, like I mentioned, I've lived there myself for 5 years, but it's also a city that is renowned for being constantly in flux and changing and growing. It has a very unique demographic situation whereby you have something like 90% of the population are foreigners, foreign born, less 10% and less who are local nationals, Emirati nationals. At any given time, if you leave more than 6 months between a visit, you're going to find a new building or a new shop or a new store. And so aesthetically, it's always changing. Things are being built, roads, bridges, canals. I mean, really, we're not talking a little project. We're talking a really big, completely mind-shifting infrastructure and setup. How for you as an Emirati does it feel to be constantly witnessing this change, and how does it impact your sense of belonging and identity, if at all?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, very good question. Yeah. Like on one hand, I find myself proud of my country, for the ways it has grown, especially, in a short period of time. And I think anyone who's grown up in the 90s or before has witnessed even more bigger change compared to those born, now, a kind of thing. So on one hand, I do find myself appreciating how change has always been a part of the identity, what makes Dubai, right? It has always been part of it, and these intercultural interactions, whether people decide to stay long term or they are transitional and just stay a bit and then leave, that has also been part of Dubai's character as well. And I do find myself feeling, proud about these things. Um, And at the same time, Emiratis themselves are also proud of their culture, and I do appreciate that we can both have intercultural diversity while also being connected to our own traditions and culture. So these are things that are positive and that I will stay proud of, right? And at the same time, I do also believe that sometimes when there's constant changes, constant rapid urbanization, it can create challenges in having a sense of place. And I've become more and more accepting of this, over time. But I do notice that when I go visit the States again, Boston in particular, which has not changed as rapidly or as much
Yeah.
in comparison, so I have mixed feelings. I guess maybe to answer your question, I would say I have mixed feelings. There's a part of me that's proud and that appreciates how far we've come. There's a part of me that wishes that we could do more to inculcate people's sense of place and connection with place.
How much does that come up with people
Hmm.
that you meet?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I would say it comes up in different ways, maybe not necessarily in the way I described it, but one version that I kept hearing coming up is, especially with people who grew up moving schools a lot or moving countries a lot. Um, so they may almost mistrust getting too close to people because they might feel, oh, I'm going to say goodbye to them again, right? In another sense, some people may be afraid of losing their friendships and, with the moves. There are others where, on the contrary, this may have given them a positive quality, not necessarily negative, where maybe that experience of constantly moving and shifting and not feeling that rootedness didn't quite matter to them as much, but it may have given them the skill of being able to quickly make friends and connect wherever they happen to find themselves in, right? So I don't want to assume that's always negative. It really depends on the person, but definitely this theme does come up.
Yeah. I mean, but as you said, it's not all about the negative. I think there's a duality to almost everything in life. And as you mentioned yourself in answer to the question about your sense of belonging in Dubai, there's a lot of pride mixed in with also a little bit of confusion or nostalgia, and the two are probably very interwoven, perhaps even a difficulty with difficulty in the sense of difficulty recognizing that you have these two aspects of it. But I suppose, to ask it bluntly, do you feel a sense of belonging in Dubai today?
I would say my idea of what makes a sense of belonging has shifted over the years. And I definitely thank my late mentor, for that. I think many of us when we're younger, right, we assume to belong means we have to fit in.
Yeah,
And right, and I think
yeah,
unfortunately sometimes this also gets encouraged in our culture where we care a lot about what other people think about us, how they see us, what we call
yes,
our sum'ah, right, our
yeah,
reputation. And unfortunately it does have consequences, especially as women, right? So there is that systemic aspect, a cultural aspect there too, that can have people assume that to belong must mean to fit in, to please others, right? So,
yes,
so that has been a big part of how I initially defined belonging without realizing that was how I was defining it, right? Until my mentor, my past mentor, pointed that out to me. And then he asked me, if belonging was not about fitting in for you, what would it be about instead?
right.
So that helped me reflect, and I think as of today, but who knows, this might change after we finish recording this podcast. But as of today, I would say for me, belonging means, where can I, two things actually, where can I experience a sense of wonder, whether it's in the people I'm with, whether it's in the nature. When I say nature, I don't mean I have to go to an isolated place. I can experience nature in the city, in the weeds that grow in the cracks and the birds that pass by, So can I experience a sense of wonder in this place? And second, do I feel like I have something to contribute? And definitely, I can say after having been back here for some
Yeah.
time now that yes, I do have a lot to offer.
I love that definition of belonging. That I think these are very helpful signposts actually to look at and questions to ask oneself when they're feeling out of place. Is actually, do you have these elements? And I know they may expand and differ slightly from person to person, but I do really like that, what you're saying, particularly the aspect of, actually both, but I was going to say particularly the aspect of, do I have something to contribute? But I think it's equally important to be able to have a sense of wonder about the place that you are in, that you're still, there's a certain exploration and discovery, but it's also, I think, a two-way street. So you are taking something from this place and sort of absorbing it, but then you're also giving back to it. So it's kind of like ultimately belonging is a sort of giving and receiving cycle,
Yes.
I would say.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
sounds like, right?
Yeah, I didn't think of it from that lens, but no, you're right. It's exactly it. Like I do recognize maybe for some people they may have different metrics for what belonging mean for them, and that's equally valid. Like for some people, they'd say where they belong is where they feel free, where they feel freedom, right, to be as they are and who they are, and that's a valid thing, right?
Yes, absolutely. I suppose that also makes sense. And I think, though, that's perhaps an additional perspective that those who have been unfortunate enough to be very repressed or not able to be themselves would rank that as high up. I think for me, perhaps I take that as an assumption that that's like a requisite. It's a very necessary part, but to recognize that isn't the case for everyone.
Exactly.
And in terms of what you are contributing, it is massive in my opinion, but also I'm sure in many others, the practice that you work at, the writing that you do, but ultimately your work in mental health in the UAE, I'm sure, is of huge welcome to the population. And I would like to know from you if you could give a sort of snapshot of where you see mental health awareness and services in the UAE or around the world is increasingly an important one, and one that is being discussed more in mainstream media among families and friends, but it is on a varying degrees. I'm speaking about this from someone who's based in London, England, and so yes, there's a lot of discussion and talk about it, but even so, we're still what I would call in the early days of just sort of lifting the lid off of this very important topic and starting to have these conversations. And I do also know that there is, to a certain extent, that in the Middle East, but most likely not quite as advanced and advanced and open discussion, I mean, as in some parts of the world. So where do you see it today?
Yeah. I mean, definitely I've seen it come a long way. Like I remember when I first wanted to study psychology, right? How people would respond to me, saying that versus today, right? And also there at the time there were no schools offering a graduate degree in counseling or clinical psychology, but now we have more options compared to back in those days. And also, there were barely many private clinics, like maybe a small handful. Uh, and we had maybe a couple of inpatient units, um, but definitely, it was nowhere where it is now in comparison. Now, at least in Dubai, I can't speak for the other Emirates, but at least in Dubai, we've had a lot more options when it comes to private clinics popping up all over the city. Um, we still have a long way to go when it comes to having more clinics available and accessible in the other Emirates, I would say.
Right.
Abu Dhabi is I think getting better, but I'd say the other Emirates definitely, I'd say there needs to be more when it comes to access. Um, and when it comes to also inpatient units, we are not having enough beds. And I think we still need to do more to expand access to those, as well, and improving the quality of their services. They definitely improved over the years, but I still think we have work to do in that department. I would also say that over time we've had more laws change when it comes to crisis and suicide prevention. Before, attempting suicide was seen as a criminal offense in the UAE. They changed the law, as now we recognize that, people don't just wake up one day wanting to kill themselves like that. Like they're usually under immense suffering, whether internal or external, that has them come to the point where they feel that life is no longer worthwhile for them. And to try and punish that would actually worsen the situation. So definitely there's been a growing recognition that, these people need help. And also, I think to both Dubai and Abu Dhabi, we have now addiction rehabilitation centers, which before we did not have. So now there's also a growing understanding that these people are not criminals. They are people who need help, and we need to support them, and we need to support their families. And I love that the addiction center here in Dubai, they do a lot of work with families and not just the individuals, which I think is wonderful. So we definitely come a long way there. But again, we need to have more centers so that way it can be more accessible for more people in the country. And while some insurance companies are covering mental health services in the private sector, unfortunately, there are not enough of them to do so. And even though they cover a limited amount, unless you have extremely lucky and, work in a corporate company that can afford to give you a good quality, health insurance that can cover it in an unlimited way. But that's not most people in the country. So many people, they feel that the private sector is very expensive, partly because we have high overhead fees to deal with. Already our training was very expensive, and there are still providers out there who are having student debt to pay off. And then licensing, we have to pay for that. And not just the licensing itself, we have to renew it every year, right?
Wow.
And then part of renewing it, also we have to take extra trainings as continuing education to update our knowledge because the field keeps changing. So that also costs money. And then the price of rent for the offices have shot up around the world, not just here in the UAE, but all over the world. The prices have gone up, and so that creates a big overhead cost for people. On top of it, you have to also pay the administrative fees, and you have to pay up reception staff, you have to pay up different people, right? So, but unfortunately, all of that falls on the price of the therapy that the client is paying for, unfortunately, and the therapist ends up making less from that, right? So, at least in Dubai, I cannot speak for other Emirates, I can't speak for the rest of the region, but in the private sector, clinicians can make anywhere from 30% of the commission from what the person pays to, if they're very, very lucky, 60%, right? But on average, most people are making 50, right? So half. So basically what the client pays, half goes to overhead, half goes to the clinician. But if they're less lucky, the clinician only gets 30% and the rest 70% goes up to the overhead fees, right? So unfortunately, I think we need to do more work to make our services more accessible to more people, and at the same time still make sure that providers earn a sustainable enough income.
Yeah. No, absolutely. My gosh, I mean, you really lifted the lid there on what the costs involved with actually providing the services. And I think it's really important to know that, because you're absolutely right to say that therapy is prohibitively expensive for many people. And
and sorry to interrupt, but I'd also add the government sector, right? Even though it's much more affordable compared to the private sector, however, many, especially of the Emiratis, prefer not to go for mental services in the government sector because they're worried about their file becoming linked with the rest of their medical records. And they're
Yes.
concerned about privacy, given
Yeah.
that it's a small community, people know each other. Whereas in the private, it's more easy to separate. But still, people have those concerns about notes. How private are they really? Who has access to them? Especially if people come from large families that are well connected, they're concerned. What if someone who is extended family sees this? So I guess one challenge is, how do we both protect the person's privacy and at the same time ensure that the providers are doing the work they're doing, that the licensing bodies require us, like things like
Yeah.
keeping notes up to date, making sure we're licensed, making sure our notes are secure. Because after all, in any country you go, we have licensing bodies who come and they audit and they check, oh, is your
Right.
clinic private? Is it clean? Is it safe? Are your notes secure? Did you update this person's notes? Right? So those things, that there will be a problem wherever you go, not just here in the UAE, but at the same time, how do we ensure people feel safe with that reality, in mind?
Are your clients predominantly locals or expats?
Actually, it makes it interestingly, when I started my first job, I had more expats than locals. And then when I moved to this job, I noticed I started having more clients who are locals, most of whom hear about me through word of mouth or they find me through Instagram. But I do get people, also expats, mostly from South Asian background, but I do get from other countries as well. And I think part of what made that happen was because I find that since there aren't many Emiratis in the mental health field, right? I find that many employers, maybe they're well intentioned, right? But they may assume that, oh, she's Emirati, she's Muslim, then, she'd be better fit for other Emiratis, other Muslims, kind of thing. Versus, well, I may have other expertise to offer
Yeah.
aside from my cultural background,
Yeah.
That's not the only thing I have to offer. But sometimes it's not necessarily their fault, right? It can also be that particular clients may happen to seek me out,
Yeah.
right, more
Yeah.
than others, and may feel, oh, we want someone who shares our culture, who gets things that I don't have to sit down and educate and explain.
Yep, going back to that point. But on the flip side, you did mention, the UAE and Dubai, small country, small population, small city, as big as it is on the world stage, it's still ultimately a small place. And
Yes.
with a small local population comes the intimacy that people, pretty much everybody knows everybody. Do you find that is a hindrance when it comes to the local population either coming to see you and or just seeking out help in general?
Yeah, good question. Yeah. I mean, it's funny, like I find that I get very opposite reactions to this. On one side, there might be people who, when they find out I am local, like, no, right? And then there's other people, no, they specifically sought me out for that reason, right? Specifically. But for me personally, if I see someone who has a family name where I feel, oh, they might know my family very, very well, and it's very likely that I'm going to be seeing them often, then I
Right.
prefer to refer out,
Yeah.
But I do let them know that all that. But if there's someone where, okay, maybe my family might know their family, but I personally don't see them that often. My parents don't see them that often. So there's not really any conflict of interest. I still bring it up that there's that, but I ask them for their comfort level. Will you feel comfortable proceeding?
Are there any particular recurring themes that arrive at your practice? I mean, of course, with keeping the utmost confidentiality and without necessarily getting too much into specifics, but I'm intrigued to know, within this small cohort and community that you see, are there things that come up more often than not that you're like, maybe this is a societal issue overall?
Yeah. One is definitely navigating workplace culture, especially if it's a toxic office culture. That's a big one I keep getting, regardless of the person's cultural background, I find. and it can come in different versions, right? But that's very common theme. Also, I would say relationship problems, whether it's platonic or romantic. And I think if we're adding a romantic element, sometimes there can be that combined with navigating maybe conservative family expectations around that. So that can be a common thing. Intergenerational stuff, especially if I'm working with not only Emiratis, but also expats who maybe their parents grew up less privileged, but
Yeah.
they may have grown up with much more privilege in comparison. So there can be, intergenerational clashes, right, around that I get. Um, Also, maybe another theme, trauma is one as well. And I think for me, in a way, it's not surprising, but I guess when I started off, I didn't expect to hear this amount of trauma. Like I was thinking, oh, maybe all this trauma training I had in the US will not be relevant here. But apparently, no, it turned out to actually be more than relevant over here. Particularly if I'm working with expats who came from regions that are currently, unfortunately, labeled as conflict zones,
Yeah.
right? So that becomes, very important to have that trauma-informed lens, right, in mind when I work with these people. But even Emiratis who grew up here all their life and all that, definitely not like contrary to popular belief, not all of them lived privileged lives, contrary to popular belief. And I think we do need to have more of these conversations. And unfortunately, I find, even though I am glad that we're talking more about mental health, I don't feel like we're talking about trauma enough,
Right.
especially when it comes to intimate partner abuse or family abuse,
Yeah.
particularly sexual violence. I think it's barely, if ever, spoken about. So, not surprisingly, when people come to me, they feel very alone in their experience. And more often than not, I am the first living soul they ever said it to.
Wow. That's also a big responsibility, I suppose. Does it feel
Yeah,
like it?
yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. It does.
You do write quite a bit. You're a columnist, and you've also contributed to other publications. Have you ever written about this topic specifically? Intimate violence, relationship violence, sexual violence?
Not quite yet. It's definitely in my radar. I have kind of mentioned it indirectly in other
Yeah.
articles, but I'm trying to find a way to talk about these topics in a way that's also culturally sensitive
Yeah.
here, right? So, but it's definitely something that it is within, my plan, hopefully to write about these topics more.
I mean, it just goes to show if you, as a professional with a wealth of experience behind you and such awareness and insight and confidence in your field, is still tiptoeing around the right way to package this
Yeah.
very important topic, how must it be for people who don't have all of this medical training, awareness, and background? It is absolutely a huge topic, and I think goodness help everybody once finally the lid is lifted off of it, because it's there. And I think people know, we know that this is a big problem. But as you rightfully pointed out, it just isn't being spotlighted enough or addressed enough for various reasons that are very tied into culture and shame and
Yes.
the dynamics
Right.
between men and women.
And I
Yeah.
think and I think it's extra complicated here in this culture because see in the West, so often people talk about abuse. They're like, oh, you can just leave your abuser. You can just leave the abusive situation. But here, it's not always possible for everybody to do that. And especially when you're dealing with the abuse at a family level, right? It becomes difficult when the family is concerned about their reputation. There is a collectivistic culture. So this idea of cutting out relationships, it's a difficult one for people. So then people are kind of stuck trying to figure out, how do I navigate any interactions I happen to have with a family member who happened to be someone who abused me and hurt me and didn't get called out for. That's not the case with everybody. Like, I've definitely heard stories where families are much more supportive of the person who was hurt, which I'm glad that there are some who
That
have
is.
that level of awareness and did stand up in solidarity with the person. But unfortunately, that's not always the case.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add in. I know that you said in the West, there's more of this idea of you can just leave your abuser, but even here now, there is definitely a change in that mindset of understanding that even if the option is technically available to you, when you are in that dynamic and there
Yes,
is a fundamental power imbalance, that it is not as straightforward as just
that's
open
true.
the door
Yes,
and walk out.
of course, yeah, and
So yeah, just.
definitely, yeah,
But I do
yeah,
understand
yeah.
what you mean. I think in certain parts of the world, it's not only that psychologically it's not possible, but that actually
Exactly.
practically speaking, in places, in countries where you have literally families living together in one house
Yes,
or in one apartment block, it isn't actually technically straightforward, and
exactly.
the families are so enmeshed together, and not only like families within the family, but then families, sort of like this
Yeah,
network, and then that makes it even more complicated.
exactly.
But I
Yeah.
do understand your point.
Yeah, yeah, and of course, I don't want to minimize what people in the West do experience, because I've definitely worked with them, and yes, and actually, statistically speaking, at least in the States, that the point that the person decides to leave the abuser is when they're at highest risk for their life. That's when many people get killed at
Right.
worst, or even abused even worse, right? If they get found, right, by the abuser trying to leave. So definitely, even there is a high risk. But yes, I did want to add that at a cultural level, systemic level, like, yes, we now have some more services available, which is good. Compared to before, there was barely anything. Whereas now, there are more laws around this, there are more services around this. But again, it's not enough.
Yeah.
Like, I find that, in Dubai, we have one domestic violence shelter. But I think we do need to have more
Yeah.
of these services, so it's accessible to more people.
Yeah, 100%. Speaking of services, you are a consultant for the Takalam app, which is an Arabic mental health app. And it's actually been great as I've entered this sort of space to see how many new conversations, services, online accounts there are in Arabic about, dealing with mental health, and which I'm really happy to see, and also feel like a sense of pride, but just like grateful because it's in the actual local language, and that makes it much more accessible. Can you talk to me a little bit about Takalam and what your role with them is?
Yeah, yeah. So Takalam is actually run by two Arab women who are based here in UAE. So it is a UAE-based mental health app. And this is one of the other things I forgot to mention that I'm proud of about the country when it comes to where we are at in mental health, is that now, especially with more support for startups and more encouragement for startups, particularly women founders, I find that we've had this influx of mental health startups, especially during the coronavirus pandemic. Yeah, but like Takalam offers online individual therapy services at different price points. So it's meant to be fitting the financial needs of different people. So I like that these apps have the potential, right, to help address some of the accessibility barriers that people have to going to private clinics here in the UAE.
Yeah.
The only issue is not everybody has access to a private home with consistently good internet connection. Especially if you're living with an intergenerational household, as you can imagine, some people don't necessarily feel comfortable having an online therapy session,
Yeah.
but others may have that luxury to, or privilege, right, to have a private space where they can do just that, and that's wonderful, right? Not everybody does, but still a step in the right direction. And I'm glad that we have this as another option for people who maybe they feel uncomfortable even being seen in the waiting room. So some people
Yeah.
that can be a cultural barrier, is to even be seen in the waiting room. uh, or to even have their name linked in a file, even if nobody can see the contents of the notes and it's private unless they give permission. But still, like you're signing a consent document, you're giving your ID, your name is still linked to the fact that you're in the clinic and you're seeing this therapist. And that's a very valid concern people have about privacy. Whereas online, again, anything online is never perfect with privacy, but it's definitely better than this system,
Yeah.
for sure. And most of these online apps, they don't necessarily have a note-taking system in them. That's the therapist's responsibility to figure out if their license requires them to update notes. But that gives clients, extra security, knowing that, okay, I just sign in, I make an account, I book with a therapist, and that's it, kind of thing. Plus, it gives access to more global therapists. Aside from therapy, Takalam also is offering journaling capacities in the app and mood tracking, and they have videos, educational videos, and webinars that they're hosting for corporate workplace wellness as well. Now they're expanding into university student wellness as well, and I'm helping them with designing programs for these. So they do special packages for employers, and universities. And their hope is that way, instead of having the end user being the one to pay, right, it would be maybe, for example, through the employer, right,
Yeah.
who pays the package that helps reach, more people.
Wow, it sounds amazing. Such a great initiative and application. Do you see the future of therapy as going online? And I know you've mentioned some of the benefits to that, accessibility, costs, but do you see any drawbacks, any limitations?
Yeah, I mean, one limitation, as I mentioned earlier, is that not everybody has access to a private space
Yeah.
or consistently good internet connection to do online therapy. And other limitations are that, luckily, Takalam is HIPAA compliant, right? So we have that, but not every online app is or is able to do that. And even with HIPAA compliance, right, there are certain holes in it when it comes to anything online, unfortunately. So I still think that we have a long way to go before we can ensure a truly 100% secure, system for people. But it's definitely better than nothing. That's for sure. And I would say definitely we need to expand more language capacities. I mean, luckily Takalam has Arabic English in place, which is awesome. And we do have therapists who speak Arabic. And we have other therapists who speak other languages, like Gujarati, Hindi, among many others.
Okay.
But it would be nice if we could have, more of the content and website be in these other languages, given that, especially in the Gulf, at least in UAE, about 50% of the population is South Asian, Southeast Asian. So it'd be good to have their languages also more represented. But definitely we're taking a positive step toward such accessibility.
Wonderful. It is great to know that there is wider accessibility for a service that is much needed. The last thing I want to touch on with you is perhaps going a bit more personal, or marrying the personal and the professional. And I mentioned obviously that you do a lot of writing, and I came across your blog where you were writing your Ramadan reflections, and they were very very thoughtful, very moving, writing, quite, a lot of depth and personal reflections in that. And I also know that you write poetry. I haven't sadly had the chance yet to read it, but I know that you've been published in several places. And I wanted to ask you about that process and what it means to you personally. And I sort of wondered as well if the poetry aspect of it, if there was any sort of tie-in culturally, because the UAE and the Gulf region is quite known for being a poetic culture. That's their primary source of creative expression, has always been through poetry. And I was curious about how you got to poetry and what it means for you in terms of processing.
Yeah. So technically, I started to write and do creative writing in general since I was 9 years old. But poetry in particular, I didn't take it seriously until I was 14
Mm-hmm.
onwards. Uh, but what got me into writing was, I'd say, reading.
Yeah.
And I think especially reading Aesop's fables that was gifted to me by a family friend, and then later Harry Potter, as really most
Yeah.
90s kids got into. My age was matching Harry's age each with each
Yeah.
book release. So it was wonderful. So I think just appreciating words and how words come together, how writers can make you even visualize things,
Mm.
right? With just simple words on a page. I think that always fascinated me. On top of it, actually, speaking of culture, my maternal grandmother, she writes poetry in Arabic, actually, but she's never published them. And
Mm.
she writes them in very random places, like whether it's a random notebook paper
Yeah.
there, on a receipt, a piece of receipt, she'll write
Yeah.
something. On a
Mm-hmm.
tissue box, she'll write something. She's been one influence. And also, my father's side, also my grandfather, before he passed away, he also wrote
Mm-hmm.
poetry as well, but again, never published. But it just
Yeah.
seems that in both sides of my family, right, people who have had some kind of relationship with the written word and love for the written word. But for me, I turned to reading and writing because, I was an awkward child who was bullied, right? So I felt that books kept me company.
Yeah.
And generally, I find that I express myself better when I write
Mm-hmm.
versus when I talk. And people get puzzled by that. But I explain that, when you talk, you're using a very different part of your brain than when you're writing.
Yeah.
And plus, as a more introverted person, let's say writing helps me slow down and process my thoughts better than talking where I have to say them right then and there and I cannot edit what I'm saying.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, very good point. Um, there is yeah. I mean, I do both, and so I understand exactly what you mean about the difference in writing. You are, by virtue of the process, kind of forced to reflect and select your words, but also um, there's a certain depth that you access with writing
Mm.
that you don't quite with speaking. Even though with speaking, I find that what I get is maybe a more instantaneous connection, but it's not always quite as deep, the levels of where I'm going. Whereas when I think about when I write, I'm sort of almost always like going one layer on, like with each paragraph, it's like and another
Mm.
layer below and another layer below.
Yeah, yeah.
But for me also personally, when it's come to poetry, I haven't published, but I, like you, started writing when I was really young. And so I've always sort of, since 9, had like my sort of poetry and collections and um, I started performing in places, just spoken word, a few years ago, but I'm still kind of a little bit shy about it. I'm getting slowly less so, but I think it's also partly because it's so personal and deep what I write about that I feel a little bit exposed when I would share it. But then I also get such a sense of relief when I'm going through a certain thing and then I write this poem, and that transference from these deep emotions that I may not fully understand, or these thoughts that are just sort of swirling, to then having a process by which I write them and this certain flow on page has such a huge impact on me. Do you find that's the same for you?
Yeah, definitely. I find that I might discover things or rediscover things that maybe would be harder to do if I were talking out loud. And I just love that. I think the best writing for me is when I enter this flow state and uh, and just things come up, naturally. Maybe I edit later, but it's just really fun when that happens. Or in the moment, like I feel like I can play with words and images more than I'm able to with regular writing, and I like that I can express ideas in less words compared to when I write regularly.
Yeah. So when are we going to be able to read some of your poetry? I saw on your link tree that it said coming soon.
Yes, yes. There's already a few posted on my Instagram page itself, but I was hoping
Okay.
to organize them better in Linktree, and then I just didn't get around that.
I'd love to read them and see how you use your words in
Yeah.
this way.
And
But
sometimes I find that too, that at times when I have clients who like to write, that creates another interesting area we can incorporate into therapy itself.
I think what I
Yes,
like
yes.
about writing is the space that it creates between me and the situation, the thoughts, the feelings. And within that space is where there's some relief and understanding. I think
Yes,
that's what I
exactly.
find.
Yep.
Yeah. Reema, it has been such a pleasure, really, really, really great, wonderful pleasure to speak with you, to hear all of your insights and your experience. The work that you do is incredible and so valuable in a region that is in great need for minds and hearts like yours. So thank you for the work that you do. And thank you very much for giving your very valuable time to Third Culture Therapy Podcast. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you so much for this conversation. I look forward to listening to the episode and also to all your other episodes, on the
Yeah,
podcast. I really enjoy the conversations you have there.
wonderful. Thanks, Reema. I wish you a wonderful day and we'll be in touch soon.
You too, Leila. Take care.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Check out the show notes for more details about my wonderful guests, including where you can find them on social media. If you enjoyed listening to this, please do spread the good word, share with friends, family, cousins, and colleagues, and please, please, please like and leave a review on whatever platform you are listening to this podcast. Your support is crucial for the show's success, and a couple of clicks from you will mean the world to me. Go to my website, leilamaghrabi.com, and follow me on Instagram and Twitter for more news on future episodes.